Hello everyone and welcome back to Literature with Preeti Raj. In our previous lecture, we understood what literary movements are and why they are important in the study of English literature. Today, we are going to begin one of the earliest literary movement, the Scottish Chaucerian. So this topic is extremely important if you're preparing for UGC NET, assistant professor examination or any other university examination because questions are usually asked from the poets, their important works and their contribution to the English literature. So, by the end of this lecture, you will understand who the Scottish Chaucerians were, why were they called as the followers of Chaucer's, what distinguished their poetry, and who are the major Scottish Chaucerians and English Chaucerian poets. So, let us begin with the topic. So, before we begin with the individual poets, let us first understand who the Scottish Chaucerians actually were. The Scottish Chaucerians were a group of Scottish court poets who flourished between 1425 and 1550 during the early Renaissance period. They were considered among the earliest and the most influential poets of the Scottish Renaissance because they played a vital role in shaping the future of Scottish literature. Now, you might be wondering what exactly is a court poet? A court poet is a writer who is associated with the royal courts. Now, these poets they composed poems of kings, queens, nobles, and the members of the aristocracy. Their works they often celebrated royal events, victories, marriage, and important politics or social occasions as well. Now, another interesting term that you should keep in mind is Makaris, sometimes called as Makaris. I'll tell you the spelling Makaris, or you can also spell it as Makeris. So, this is Scots word for makers or poets. Just as we use the word poets today, people in the medieval Scotland use the word makar to refer to someone who created poetry. So, the Scottish Chaucerians made an important contribution to literature because they helped establish a distinct Scottish literary tradition. Their writings it developed or reflected the Scotland's language, culture and identity, laying a strong foundation for the growth of Scottish literature. Now that you know who the Scottish Chaucerians were, the next question arises, why are they called as Scottish Chaucerians? So, why are they called as Scottish Chaucerian? The answer is that they had a tremendous influence of Geoffrey Chaucer. Okay, so as many of you already know, that Geoffrey Chaucer is often called as the father of English literature because he demonstrated that English could be used to produce great literary works at a time when Latin and French were considered the dominant languages of learning and literature. The Scottish poets greatly admired Chaucer's writing. They adopted many of his literary techniques such as allegory, dream visions, courtly love, rhyme royal, moral storytelling. Okay, so his works became a model that inspired a new generation of poets in Scotland. However, there is one important point that you should be remembering is that these poets were not simply imitators. They borrowed Chaucer's artistic method but adapted them to reflect the Scottish culture, the language, the traditions, and the experiences. In other words, if we say that they learned from Chaucer while creating something uniquely Scottish. So, because of this strong literary influence, later scholars and literary historians refer to them as Scottish Chaucerians. So, remember this idea that they are called as the Scottish Chaucerians not because they were Scottish poets alone, but because they were Scottish poets who were deeply inspired by Geoffrey Chaucer's literary tradition. Now that we understand the origin of their name, the next question is why did the literary movement emerge? So far, we know who the Scottish Chaucerians were and why they are called as the Scottish Chaucerians. But another point or question arises is that why this literary movement emerged in the first place. The rise of Scottish Chaucerians was not accidental. It developed from a combination of literary, political, and cultural changes that were taking place during the 15th century. So, the first important factor was the death of Geoffrey Chaucer in 1400. Chaucer had been the dominant literary figure for this generation. So, after his death, English literature entered a comparatively less productive period. and there was no immediate writers of similar stature to continue his literary leadership. At the same time, England was experiencing considerable political instability. The conflict of the 15th century, it affected the wider cultural environment and contributed to a period in which literary activity was comparatively less vigorous. So Scotland, however, was developing in a somewhat different direction. There was growing awareness of Scottish cultural identity, including an increase in the appreciation of Scottish language, traditions, and national distinctiveness. Another important feature is the development of Scots as a literary language. Scottish poets increasingly demonstrated that Scots could be used for sophisticated and accomplished literary expression. Now, this helped strengthen the development of a distinct Scottish literary tradition. The Scottish royal court also played a very important role in this. Courtly and aristocratic circles provided an important environment for literary activity, giving poets opportunities to compose and circulate poetry among educated and influential audiences. And then we come to the most important influence, that is Chaucerian tradition. As you already know, Scottish poets deeply admired Chaucer's achievement. They borrowed his literary forms and techniques, but they did not just simply, copy it. Instead, actually, they adapted the Chaucerian tradition to their own Scottish context, incorporating Scottish language, culture, values, and experiences. So, the emergence of Scottish Chaucerian can be understood as the meeting of two important forces: Chaucerian literary influence and Scotland's growing cultural and literary identity. And this gives us a very useful line that we could remember. Chaucer provides the literary model, but Scotland gave it a distinct identity. So that combination ultimately produces the literary tradition we know as Scottish Chaucerian movements. Let's talk about the nature of Scottish Chaucerian. So, before we examine the specific literary techniques that were used by the Scottish Chaucerian, we are going to talk about the overall nature of their poetry. Scottish Chaucerian poetry occupies a fascinating position in literary history because it stands between two literary worlds. On the one hand, it retains many features of the medieval literary tradition, particularly allegory, morality, symbolism, and courtly poetry. On the other hand, we begin to see the emerging sensibility of Renaissance with a greater interest in human experiences, individuality, and artistic expression. But what makes this poetry particularly distinctive is its Scottish identity. So the poets were influenced by Chaucer, but they did not simply reproduce the literary, English literature models. They adapted actually Chaucer's traditions to their own Scottish language, culture, imagination, and experiences. So their poetry is also marked by considerable artistic and imaginative richness. We find carefully constructed narrative, symbolism, and poetic craftsmanship and an appreciation of courtly elegance. At the same time, these poets often carry a moral purpose. So, literature could entertain, but it could also instruct the readers and encourage the reflection on human behavior and values. Now that we understood the nature of this poetry as a whole, let us move to the next slide and I'll tell you the specific literary features that were there. So, the major characteristics that we can see, the first important feature is allegory. So, in an allegory, the story has two levels of meaning. On the surface, we read about the characters and the events, but beneath the surface, they represent deeper ideas such as virtue, justice, love, or wisdom. Next, the second important feature is dream vision. So instead of narrating the events directly, the poet imagines falling asleep and experiencing a dream. So this technique gave poets the freedom to discuss complex ideas like love, morality, religion, or even politics in a creative and symbolic manner. The third characteristic is pastoral poetry and eclogues. So these poems celebrates the beauty of nature and rural life. So there were shepherds, forests, rivers, villages. They became, more than just a setting. They were used to explore the human emotions, relationship, and philosophical ideas. Next up, we have satire. So many of Scottish Chaucerians used humor and irony to expose corruption, greed, hypocrisy, and the weaknesses of the society. Their aim was not simply to make readers laugh, but also to encourage the social reform. Another defining character is the moral purpose of the poetry. Now, these poets, they believe that literature should not only entertain but also educate. So, almost every major work contains an ethical message or an important lesson about life and human behavior. Finally, we come to what we call as the identity, that is the Chaucerian style. So, the Scottish Chaucerians, they admired Geoffrey Chaucer's narrative techniques, his elegant storytelling, his use of rhyme royal, and his rich descriptive style. However, they were not just imitating him, they actually blended these literary techniques with Scottish language, their tradition, their cultural identity, creating a style that was both familiar and distinctly Scottish. So, together, these characteristics they make Scottish Chaucerian poetry one of the most important bridges between medieval literature and Renaissance. Now, let's talk about the major Scottish Chaucerian. So far, we have understood the origin, the historical background, the major characteristics of the Scottish Chaucerian movements. Now it's time to meet the four poets who made this movement one of the most important periods of Scottish literary history. So, although all of them were inspired by Geoffrey Chaucer, each poet they developed a unique literary identity. We have James I of Scotland, who was not only a king but also a poet. He is remembered for as the royal poet who introduced the Chaucerian tradition into Scottish court poetry. The second is Robert Henryson. He is often regarded as the finest Scottish Chaucerian. His works are admired for their moral philosophy and psychological depth. The third is William Dunbar. William Dunbar, perhaps the most versatile poet of the group. He wrote beautiful love poems, powerful satirical works, and deeply moving elegies. Finally, we have Gavin Douglas. He is a scholar, bishop, and a translator who introduced the greatness of classical literature into Scottish writing through his translation of Virgil's Aeneid. Now, in the next slide, we are going to talk about them individually, their lives, their major works, literary style, their contribution to the Scottish literature. Before that, I have put a picture in front of you where you can see the pictures of James I of Scotland, Robert Henderson, William Dunbar, and Gavin Douglas. So let's talk about James I of England. James I occupies a unique place in literary history because he was not only the king of Scotland but also one of the earliest and the most accomplished poets. An important turning point in his literary life came during his imprisonment in England. It was here that he became familiar with the works of Geoffrey Chaucer, whose poetry left a deep impression on him. So, inspired by Chaucer's literary technique, James adopted an element such as courtly love, allegory, and rhyme royal. But instead of simply copying Chaucer, he adapted these techniques to reflect the Scottish life and the culture. As a result, James is remembered as the poet who successfully introduced the Chaucerian literary tradition into Scotland while giving it a distinct Scottish identity. His poetry, if we see, it beautifully combines personal experiences, romantic themes, allegorical imagination, moral reflection, and elegant poetic craftsmanship. Now, this achievement is best seen in his masterwork, The Kingis Quair. The title simply means the King's Book. It is considered one of the finest example of Scottish Chaucerian poetry and remains James' first most celebrated work. One of the reasons this poem is so fascinating is that it is semi-autobiographical. In other words, it is based on James' own life and personal experiences. So while he was imprisoned in England, James is believed to have seen Lady Jane Beaufort from the window of his prison. So, according to the poem, he fell in love with her at the first sight. So, this love eventually led to their marriage in 1424, making the poem both a literary work and a reflection of his personal life. So, from a literary point of view, the King's Quair clearly shows the influence of Geoffrey Chaucer. It follows the dream vision tradition where the poet presents his experiences through the framework of dream. Another important examination point that you should keep in mind is that the poem is written in rhyme royal, and the rhyme scheme is AB, AB, BCC. Okay, so this is one of the Chaucer's favorite verse forms, and James adopted it with remarkable skill. So, through the King's Quair, James proved that Scottish poets could borrow Chaucer's literary technique while creating poetry that reflected their own experiences and Scottish identity. After James I, we'll talk about Robert Henryson, who is considered the finest Scottish Chaucerian. His works are richer in moral philosophy and are asked very frequently in our assistant professor examinations. So, after James I, we'll move to Robert Henryson, who is often considered the finest Scottish Chaucerian. His works are richer in moral philosophy and it is frequently asked in the professor examinations. So, if James I introduced us to the Chaucerian tradition in Scotland, Henderson takes that tradition further and gives it a much greater moral and psychological depth. Robertson is often regarded as the finest and the most accomplished Scottish Chaucerian. Like the other poets of this movement, he was deeply influenced by Geoffrey Chaucer. But the very important thing that he did not simply imitate Chaucer. He developed a literary personality of his own. So, what makes Henderson particularly interesting is his understanding of human nature. His characters are not merely just figures in a story, they experience emotions, they make mistakes, they suffer, so the consequences of their decisions, and that sometimes they come to understand their own mistakes by these. So this is why we frequently describe Henryson as a moral poet or moralist. His poetry repeatedly deals with questions such as what happens when human beings they make wrong choices, what is justice, what roles does the fate play in our lives, and can suffering lead to self realization? So remember, while Chaucer gave Henryson the literary foundation, Henryson added his own moral philosophy, psychological insight, and realistic characterization. His important work is the Testament of Cresseid. So this is why what connects Geoffrey Chaucer's and make it very interesting. So most of you would already be familiar of Chaucer's work Troilus and Cresseid. Okay, so Henderson takes the character of Cresseid from Chaucer's literary world and imagines what might have happened to her afterwards. So, in a sense, the Testament of Cresseid becomes a continuation of Cresseid's story. But Henderson takes the story in a much more tragic and moral direction. So, in this version, Cresseid experiences a terrible downfall. She loses her beauty, her wealth, and her social position. And through her suffering, she is eventually forced to confront the consequences of her action. Now, this is where Henderson becomes much more than just a storyteller. Remember what we said about him in the previous slide? Henderson is a moral poet, but he is also deeply interested in human psychology. So he did not just simply tell us that Cresseid made a mistake. Therefore, she must be punished. Instead, what he did is that he made us think into a much larger question. Why do human beings they make wrong choices? How much control do we actually have on our fate? Can suffering lead to repentance? And questions like should a person who had made a mistake they receive only punishment or also sympathy and forgiveness? So these questions it gives the Testament of Cresseid its extraordinary moral and psychological depth, and that is precisely why Henderson is not regarded as a mere imitator of Chaucer. He takes a Chaucerian character, continues her story, but gives that story his own moral vision and psychological interpretation. So Chaucer has written Troilus and Cresseid, okay, and Henryson has written the Testament of Cresseid. Now, there is another important works by Robert Henryson that you should keep in mind. First is Orpheus and Eurydice. So it is a retelling of famous Greek myth. So the title itself sounds very familiar to you, that it belongs to a classical Greek mythology. It tells the famous story of Orpheus, who loves his wife Eurydice so deeply that after her death he descends into the underworld in an attempt to bring her back. So whenever you see Orpheus and Eurydice associated with Henryson, remember classical mythology. Okay, so the second important work that we are going to talk about is Robene and Makyne's. Okay, so this is particularly significant because it is regarded as one of the earliest examples of Scottish pastoral poetry. Now, remember when we discussed earlier under the characteristics of Scottish Chaucerian poetry. So, in pastoral poetry, we usually encounter nature, rural settings, shepherds, human emotions. Here also, Henryson presents a dialogue between Robene and Makyne and explores the changing nature of love. So, what makes the poem interesting is the reversal of emotions. The affection is not always returned at the right moment. So, the poem it becomes a charming but also ironic exploration of love, rejection, and missed opportunity. And finally, we talk about the moral Fabillis and Aesop and Phrygian. Okay, just keep the name in mind. The title itself gives an important clue of Aesop. Okay, so these are fables that were inspired by the tradition of Aesop, Aesop, okay, in which animals behave like human beings. But Henderson is not simply telling or entertaining animal stories. Through these animals, he comments on human nature and human behavior, and the stories they carry moral lessons. And this brings us to the important characteristic of Henderson as a moralist. So even when he tries to entertain us, there is usually something that he wants us to learn from it. So from an examination point of view, if you have to keep in mind, Orpheus and Eurydice is a Greek mythology, Robene and Makyne is a pastoral love, and Moral Fabulis is a work on Aesop and morality. Now let's talk about William Dunbar. So William Dunbar, if one word I have to characterize him, I'll say it him as versatile. So why do I call him versatile? Because Dunbar was not just a poet who restricted himself to one particular subject or one particular type of poetry. He could write beautifully about love. He could write about religious and moral poetry. He could become extremely humorous and satirical while criticizing the society. He could comment on the political and courtly life. And then, in another poem, he could deeply be very serious and reflective while writing about death and morality. So, we can see completely different sides of the same poet. Another important aspect of Dunbar is that his poetry has a close connection with the Scottish royal court. His poetry gives us a fascinating picture of court life, its beauty, celebration, splendor, and elegance. But Dunbar does not always praise the society around him. He also observes its weaknesses. So, whenever he encounters the corruption, hypocrisy, greed, or social problems, he uses his wit, humor, irony, and satire to expose them. And this is what makes William Dunbar particularly interesting. He can move from beauty to ugliness, from celebration to criticism, from humor to seriousness with remarkable ease. So that is why he is remembered as one of the most versatile poets among the Scottish Chaucerian. Now let us look at the major works by William Dunbar. Let's begin with the Goldyn Targe. So, this is an allegorical dream vision, and remember, both allegory and dream vision are very important features of Scottish Chaucerian poetry. At the center of the poem is a conflict between reason and love. Now, think about this very simply. Reason represents our ability to think logically, while love represents the power of human emotion. Dunbar shows us that however strong our reason may appear to be, human emotions, particularly love, can sometimes become even more powerful. So, whenever you hear the Goldyn Targe, remember reason versus love. Next up, we have the Thistle and the Rose. So, this poem takes us into an entirely different world. Dunbar wrote it to celebrate the marriage of King James IV of Scotland and Margaret Tudor, who was the daughter of Henry VII of England. So even the title is significant. The Thistle is associated with Scotland, while the Rose is associated with England. So the poem, it celebrates not merely the marriage of two individuals, but symbolically brings together two royal and national traditions. Next up, we have another work, Tidings from Sessions. So here we meet Dunbar the satirist. So instead of celebrating beauty or royal marriage, he turns his attention towards the legal system and attacks the corruption in the law code. He uses humor, wit, and satire to expose what he sees as weaknesses and injustice in the society. And this is why I called him versatile. Now, let's talk about another work, Satire on Edinburgh. So here again, we meet Dunbar the satirist, but this time, instead of attacking the legal system, Dunbar turns his attention towards the city of Edinburgh itself. He gives us a vivid picture of the unpleasant condition of medieval Edinburgh, particularly its poor sanitation and civic problems. But rather than just simply, describing these problems seriously, Dunbar uses humor and irony to expose them. And remember, that is one of the main purposes of a satire. A satirist makes us laugh, but behind that laughter, there is usually a criticism. Now let's talk about the lament of the Makaris, the lament for the Makaris. So, first remember the word makar. We discussed it at the very beginning of the lecture. So, what is a makar? A poet or a maker. So, the lament of Makaris literally directs our attention towards the poets who have passed away. So, in this elegy, Dunbar remembers and mourns a number of important literary figures, including Geoffrey Chaucer, John Gower, John Lydgate, Robert Henryson, and John Barber, and there are many others. So, but the poem is not just simply a list of dead poets. Behind these individual deaths lies a much larger and universal idea, that is morality. So, Dunbar reminds us that it does not matter how talented, successful, famous, or respected a person becomes. Ultimately, death comes to everybody. So, this is what gives this poem a very emotional power. Now we come to the fourth and the final major Scottish Chaucerian, Gavin Douglas. Douglas was one of the last great Scottish Chaucerian and also one of the most learned poet of the Scottish Renaissance. He was not just simply a poet. He was also a bishop, a scholar, and a translator, and his scholarly background played a major role in shaping his literary career. Now, what makes Gavin Douglas particularly important in the literary history is that he stands almost at the meeting point of two different literary worlds. On one side, we have the medieval tradition. Like the other Scottish Chaucerians, Douglas was deeply influenced by Geoffrey Chaucer and inherited many features of the medieval literature. But on the other side, we can already see the growing influence of Renaissance, particularly its renewed interest in literature and the learning of the classical world. And Douglas brings these two traditions together. So that is why we can describe him as an important bridge between Middle Ages and Renaissance. His writing, it shows us the Scottish literature was no longer, simply just preserving the medieval tradition. It was also beginning to engage with the new classical and intellectual spirit of Renaissance. And this becomes especially clear when we look at the major works by him. So let us now look at the important works by Gavin Douglas. The Palice of Honour. This is one of his earliest major poems. And if you remember the characteristics of Scottish Chaucerian poetry that we have discussed earlier, you will immediately recognize two of them here. The first is allegory, and the second one is dream vision. Now, what do you understand by that? We have already learned that in an allegory, the characters, the places, the events can represent the ideas that is beyond their literal meaning. And in a dream vision, the poet uses the framework of a dream to explore those ideas imaginatively. So Douglas uses both these techniques to examine an important question. What does it actually mean to be honorable? Is honor simply having just wealth? Is it having a powerful position? Is it becoming very famous? Or is the true honor, it is something which is much more deeper. So all these questions through the poem, Douglas explores the ideas such as honor, virtue, fame, and moral responsibility, and suggests that genuine honor does not simply it comes from the wealth or the worldly power. Instead, it must be connected with virtue and righteous conduct. And here again, we can see the influence of Geoffrey Chaucer, the allegorical structure, the dream vision technique, and the style of storytelling all reflects the Chaucerian traditions. So at the same time, Douglas gives these techniques his own philosophical and moral distinction. Now we come to another achievement, that is Virgil's Aeneid. So he did a translation of Virgil's Aeneid. So first of all, who was Virgil? Virgil was one of the greatest poet of ancient Rome, and in his Aeneid is one of the most important epics of classical Latin literature. Now imagine the significance of what Douglas was doing. He was taking one of the greatest work of the classical world and making it accessible through the Scots language. His translation is generally known as Eneados, Eneados. So but Douglas here is not just simply replacing one Latin word with one Scot word. His translation it demonstrates considerable literary skills. He brings his own poetic richness, descriptive power, and literary elegance to the work. And this achievement is important for another reason. Remember what we said when we introduced Gavin Douglas. He stands at the meeting point of Middle Ages and Renaissance. So his Chaucerian and allegorical poetry connects him with the medieval tradition, while his translation to the Virgil it demonstrates the growing Renaissance fascination with the classical Greek and Roman literature. His translation also demonstrated that the Scots language was capable of expressing a sophisticated classical epic, which makes it a landmark in the development of Scottish literature. And with Gavin Douglas, we have now completed our four major Scottish Chaucerians. Now, before we conclude our discussion on Scottish Chaucerian, there is one small distinction that I would like you to understand. Were the Scottish poets the only writers who were influenced by Geoffrey Chaucer? The answer is no. Chaucer naturally had followers in England as well, and these poets are called as English Chaucerians. So, like the Scottish Chaucerians, they admired Chaucer's literary achievement and continued many aspects of his poetic tradition, his narrative style, allegory, moral concerns, courtly themes, and poetic forms. Among them, the first important person that you should keep in mind is John Lydgate. John Lydgate was extraordinarily prolific poet and a monk who was associated with Bury St. Edmunds. His major work includes Troy Book, The Fall of Princes, and the Siege of Thebes. So, and the Siege of Thebes particularly is very interesting, in which has a Chaucerian connection. So Lydgate over here imagines himself meeting Chaucer's Canterbury pilgrims and joining them on their return journey. So the connection with Chaucer becomes very much direct over here. Next up, we have an important poet, Thomas Hoccleve. Hoccleve openly regarded as Chaucer as his literary master. His most important work is The Regiment of Princes, a poem that was considered with moral and political instructions. Another important work that he has written is La Male Regile. The influence of Chaucer did not suddenly disappear with the end of 15th century. As we enter the 16th century, we still find writers continuing certain features of the older medieval tradition. Two names that you should remember is Alexander Barclay and Stephen Hawes. They are important because they show us that even when Renaissance ideas were beginning to enter the English literature, medieval forms, especially allegory, moral instructions, and satires, we are still, they were still alive with us. The influence of Chaucer did not suddenly disappear with the end of 15th century. As we enter the early 16th century, we will still find writers who were continuing certain features of the older medieval tradition. Two names that you should remember is Alexander Barclay and Stephen Hawes. They are important because they show us that even when Renaissance ideas were beginning to enter the English literature medieval forms, especially allegory, moral instructions, there were satires that were still alive. First of all, we'll talk about Alexander Barclay. Barclay belongs to the early 16th century, and his importance lies partly in the fact that he helped carry elements of the medieval literary tradition into the Tudor period. His poetry continues the tradition of morality, satire, allegory, and instructions that we have already learned or seen in the Chaucerian writing. His best known work is The Ship of Fool. It is an English adaptation of a satire by Sebastian Brandt. So, the basic idea is that the society is represented as a ship which is filled by foolish people, and their various follies and weaknesses becomes the subject of satirical criticism. But as with much medieval moral literature, the purpose is not just simply to entertain. Barclay uses satire to criticize the human weaknesses and the social vices while encouraging moral reflection. His another famous work that you could keep in mind is eclogues. So these poems they draw upon the pastoral tradition and continental literary influences. Next up we have Stephen Hawes. So Hawes is particularly interesting because of the period in which he was writing. We have now entered the beginning of 16th century. Renaissance ideas was gradually becoming stronger in England, but medieval literary traditions have not completely disappeared. And Stephen Hawes is an excellent example of this transition. He continues many features that were associated with the medieval poetry, particularly allegory, chivalry, courtly love, moral instructions. So, his most important work that you could keep in mind is the pastime of pleasure. Now, don't be misled by the word pleasure in this title. This is not simply a work about entertainment. It is an elaborate allegorical romance that brings together several important ideas: education, love, chivalry, virtue, and morality. So, the poem presents the journey and the development of its central figure in a way that will allow House to explore how an individual should acquire knowledge, virtue, and moral understanding. So, once again, we can see the medieval ideas that literature should do more than just simply, entertain. It should also teach and morally instruct the readers. This is why Hawes is important historically. He is writing at the beginning of 16th century, but his poetry continues a tradition that is strongly rooted in the medieval world. So, with that, it brings us to the end of today's lecture on Scottish Chaucerian. In this session, we explored who the Scottish Chaucerians were, why they were influenced by Geoffrey Chaucer, what are the major characteristics of their poetry, and most importantly, the poets and the works that actually shaped their literary tradition. So, our journey through literary movement doesn't end over here. In the next video, we'll meet again with another important literary movement and we'll continue exploring the fascinating history of English literature. Till then, happy learning.